Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Buddy Staples video. So today's world is going to be on Dragon World, and Dragon World is a very archetype heavy based world where basically a lot of archetypes are just self-contained and there's not a whole lot of crossover. There is some crossover, but that's more archetype to archetype specific based on the stage in which the game was made. But for the most part, Dragon World is going to be your just baseline world. So I like to think of every world was stemmed from Dragon World in terms of style and gameplay. So Dragon World is kind of your jack of all trades, master of none, but it still does a very good job at doing whatever it's doing based on its archetype. So with all that being said, an honorable mention is going to be the Dragon Shields. So there are a whole bunch of different Dragon Shields, and basically a lot of Dragon World decks have access to these Dragon Shields because they are very, very generic. So they have access to like Blue Dragon Shield, Gold Dragon Shield, Green Dragon Shield, Silver Dragon Shield, etc. So there's just a lot of different Dragon Shields that they have access to, and each one does something different, so depending on what deck you're playing, you could run any of the Dragon Shields. Next, they have Loud Voice. So this is a very, very solid defense card in which you just discard any amount of cards in your hand, and then you debuff the opponent's board for the turn, which makes it very, very hard for them to attack or deal damage. Next, they have Drago Trap. So Drago Trap is probably one of the most powerful defense spells in the game because it simply just states that the monster you choose just can't attack. So it's a little bit stronger than resting, and it's a lot stronger than nullifying, where just the monster is not allowed to attack, period. Next, they have Breaking Blade Impulse. So for a low cost of 2 life, you get to counter, choose 2 cards on your opponent's field, and rest those cards. It does have an added benefit if you're playing a G-Boost deck, but you don't need to be playing a G-Boost deck to rest 2 cards on the field. And for not paying any gauge and just paying life, that's very, very powerful. Next, they have Rhodes to Champion. So for the low cost of 1 gauge, you could either choose one of the following 2. You could either put a size 2 or greater monster from your drop to your hand, which is very good because a lot of Dragon World decks require a size 2 an item and a size 1 formation, or depending on the deck, you could even utilize a size 3. But just being able to get any size 2 or greater from your drop to your hand is very strong, on top of which it has a counter ability where you could just rest a monster on your opponent's field, which resting is very, very powerful, and the fact that Dragon World has access to another rest spell is very good. Next, they have access to Dragonic Exchange, which, for starters, you get to put the top card of your deck into your gauge. So it's gaining a gauge, and then you get to look at all the cards in your gauge and swap a card from your hand with a card in your gauge. So that's very powerful because it gives you access to more options to try to fix your hand. Next, they have access to Gar Siegen. So you can only cast this card if you've attacked 3 or more times this turn, and then counter, gain 2 life, and draw 2 cards. So just a very, very solid generic draw spell. Being able to attack 3 times in Dragon World is not very hard. Next, they have Batzz X Link. So you can only cast this card if you've attacked 3 or more times, still fitting into that kind of aggressive theme that Dragon World generally likes to try to play off of. And then counter, look at the top 3 cards from your deck, put one of them into your hand, the rest into the gauge, and then you gain a life. So it's a little bit different than Gar Siegen, in which you're just fishing at the top 3, and it makes it a little bit more of a powerful effect because the rest go into the gauge, you're still gaining a life, and you're still getting 1 card, but it's the 1 card you want out of the top 3. Next, they have access to Dragod Var. Its cast cost is dropping a soul from a card on your field and paying 1 gauge. That's not that big of a deal because most of the time we're not really utilizing the soul. Being able to utilize it as a resource is very, very strong. On top of which it has 2 abilities. and both of them you could play at counter speed. Choose a monster on your opponent's field, drop all souls from it, and destroy it. So if you're having really hard time dropping and dealing with your opponent's like heavy soul wall deck, this card just helps get around all of that. But what's more important is its other ability, which is destroy a card on your opponent's field if you do draw a card. Most of the time, you're going to use it for its second ability, but it all depends on the matchup. But what's so powerful about its second ability is not only is it drawing you a card, it allows Dragon World to have access to a card that can destroy set spells and items into virtually almost any deck. Next, they have access to Dragonic Charge and by extension Dragonic Charge Plus. So Dragonic Charge is just your generic Charge 2 gauge, and then Dragonic Charge Plus, you get a little bit of an added benefit at a slightly harder cost. So you get to put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge, then if you have 5 or less life, put 3 cards from the top of your deck into your gauge. So where Dragonic Charge only charges you 2, this allows you to charge up to 5. Next, they have access to Holy Wehr Dragon. Technically, everything has access to Holy Wehr Dragon because of its first ability where you can use it with all flags, but the fact that it originated from Dragon World is why it's going to be included here. And its call cost is pay 2 gauge, put the top card of your deck into its soul, and then when this card enters the field through Buddy Call, during the next turn, damage you take is reduced by 5. So just that first part alone is very powerful because it's a blanket fog effect. So all instances of damage you take is going to be reduced by 5. And then when this card attacks, for this turn, all cards on your opponent's field get minus 20,000 defense. So it essentially is going to be stripping away all of the opponent's defense on attack, and then on call, it's going to give you a good chance to survive through the next turn with its Buddy Call ability. And then it has double attack and Soul Guard. Next, they have access to Disturb Hand Dragon. So this is a very old and very powerful card where your opponent just can't draw cards by card effects. Drawing in Buddyfight is very good. Now, the important thing to note is he doesn't turn off the fact that they could look at the top X cards and pick 1 or 2 or whatever amount from them into the hand, so there's still ways of getting around this card, but the fact that he turns off most card draw is very powerful nonetheless. Next, they have access to My Buddy. So there's only 2 versions of My Buddy in the game. There's Danger World and there's Dragon World, and the fact that Dragon World has one isn't necessarily doing anything special. It's just a nice inclusion to have for the world. So what this card does is if you have less than 4 copies of your buddy in your deck, you may have up to 1 My Buddy in your deck, and basically that just means he's an extra copy of your buddy. And then you may Buddy Call using this card. Being able to Buddy Call just basically means you get to take the card from your buddy zone and put it onto the field, and this card will go from your hand into the buddy zone. So it's just acting as a proxy, more or less, of your buddy. Next, they have access to some pretty powerful impacts. First of which is Dragon Lord Initiation Giga Howling Crusher. It's got a lot going on, but to simplify it, you can only cast this card if you have an item and your buddy on your field. You could use Drum if you don't have a buddy, but most of the time it's going to be your buddy. And then neither you nor your opponent can have a monster in your center. So very generic Gao impact stuff. And then its cast cost is paying 3 gauge, and then choose a monster on your field and an item on your field, and deal damage to the opponent equal to the sum of their crits, and the damage can't be reduced. Being able to combine the crit of your monster and an item and deal that as damage is very powerful because there's some very high damaging items and high damaging monsters in the game. And depending on the deck, you could even boost the crit for the turn and then cast this to make it even more stronger. So it's just a very strong card to help set up a lot of OTKs in Dragon World. And then another good impact that a lot of decks can run is Thunder Lance X Tempest Buster. There is an auto deity version. It's basically the same thing, except it just requires 1 more attack than this. So what this card does is if your opponent has 5 or less life and you've attacked 3 or more times, and neither you nor our opponent have a monster in your center, you can pay 3 gauge and deal 5 damage to the opponent. This damage can't be nullified and it can't be reduced, and if your opponent's life would become 0, then they cannot revive. The last part is really why this card is so good, because there's not a lot of anti-revive cards, and the fact that this is just a generic impact that also allows your opponent just not to revive is very, very powerful. Then, Dragon World also has a couple of cards that can utilize multi-worlds. So cards that just, if you have a whole bunch of different world types on your field or in your drop, there's a couple of cards that take advantage of that. Warlord Sword Release is one of them, and its cast cost is pay 1 gauge and pay 2 life, and then draw a card for each different world name on your field, and then you can only cast this once per turn. So with the inclusion of dual worlds, it's not very hard to at least bare minimum draw 2 cards. At worst, this draws you 1 card, but to the greatest extent, it could draw you up to like 5 or 6 cards. So it's just a very powerful card depending on the deck that you're going to be running it in. And then another card that also takes advantage of multiple different worlds or dual worlds is Red Thunder Emperor's Awakening. So put the top card of your deck into your gauge and you gain 1 life. Then if you have 3 or more different worlds in your drop, put 1 card from your drop into your hand. Then if you have 6 or more, you get to draw a card. It's just a good way at trying to utilize a whole bunch of different worlds, and considering this can go into a couple of different decks depending on how the decks are built, it could still be used to a lot of effectiveness and potential. So that's kind of it for Dragon World. It was a little bit difficult to kind of formulate this list because there's just a lot of Dragon World cards, and I'm only trying to highlight the ones that I think are the most important or unique or just powerful. And a lot of the most powerful Dragon World cards are going to be archetype locked, and these are more focused around cards that aren't necessarily archetype locked. Keep that in mind when you're building your deck, because Dragon World has definitely a lot of different cards to offer, and it's a very, very powerful world. Feel free to comment on any cards you feel like I may or may not have forgotten or included, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Buddyfight content, and I will see you in the next video.